I mean, these efforts were terminated by the war when there were other concerns, and during the war there was massive labor organizing, but they were picked up again in the late 40s. And by the 1950s, just massive campaigns were launched to, I mean, the scale is incredible. There's pretty good scholarship on it, to take over everything, you know, captive audiences in factories, sports leagues, churches, schools, were textbooks in schools, cinema, you know, anything that could be reached was press, of course, to vilify unions and union leaders, particularly. They're all corrupt, you know, thugs disrupting our harmony and so on and so forth. And it's not without effect. It's a major factor in the decline of unions, and destroying unions is extremely important, because that means they're one of the few ways in which ordinary people can get together, not only to try to achieve normal rights, you know, like decent working conditions, wages, and so on, but also just to participate in a democratic process. If people are isolated, they are victims. There's very little that they can do to implement their own ideas, or even to know what their ideas are. You work these things out with other people, you organize to push them forward, and so on. And one of the results is sharp decline in industrial unions, but also a sharp decline in democracy. So our current form of democracy is one of passivity. Every 4 years, go to the polls and push a button, and you go home. Your opinions have almost nothing to do with policy. There's a huge gap between attitudes and policy, and that's the way it's supposed to be. You know, a striking illustration. The propaganda was aimed at two things, really, primarily at unions. They're terrible because they're a democratizing force and they help working people, but also just it was also aimed at democracy. You're supposed to hate the government. Actually, the business world has an ambivalent attitude towards government. It's a kind of love-hate relationship. They want the government to be very strong and powerful, but working for them. But they want everyone to hate it if it works for them. So you can see that pretty dramatically on April 15th, let's say. April 15th, when you pay your taxes, the attitude that's instilled in people is, you know, it's kind of like a day of mourning. They, those outsiders, are stealing your hard-earned money, and you're forced to give it to them because nothing you can do about it. It's coercion from an alien force. Suppose we lived in a democracy. The attitude would be the opposite. In a democratic society, people would be cheering on April 15th. They say, you know, here's the day when we all jointly contribute to carrying out the policies that we decided on. Well, that's democracy. The idea here is to turn the culture, to keep the free institutions, so they say sort of free, but ensure that the culture is totalitarian. That is that, you know, the government is some outside force you got to protect yourself against. Maybe have guns in your backyard to protect yourself if they come and get you, or, you know, try to keep them from stealing your taxes or something. And that's instilled very intensively by we have a huge industry of control of thoughts and attitudes, public relations industry, and these are its prime objectives. You can see them work. Actually, sometimes it's pretty dramatic. So take, say, Obama. He wanted to make a gesture to show, you know, his love for working people. So he went to a factory in Illinois, Peoria, to give a talk to workers at a plant. Well, his choice of a plant was interesting. He went to the Caterpillar plant. Now, that was over the objections of church and human rights groups who are proposing, objecting to the role of Caterpillar in violence, conquest, and destruction as in the Israeli-occupied territories. But it's interesting that there was no protest from the labor movement. And it's striking because Caterpillar was the first industrial organization in generations to destroy a strike by bringing in scabs. And that's pretty serious. This is, I think, 1988. It's during the General Reagan attack on the labor movement, which was severe, hated workers and tried to destroy them. But in the course of that, Caterpillar became the first industrial organization to follow the Reagan injunction to bring in strikebreakers to break strikes. Now, at that time, the United States was alone in the industrial world in permitting this, not totally alone. South Africa didn't permit it either, but a couple of years later, South Africa joined the world, so the U.S. remains alone now in the industrial world in permitting these techniques. That wasn't even brought up. In fact, I don't think even labor historians weren't aware of it, as I know from discussion, because it's, the actual history has just been wiped out of people's minds. Probably Obama and his advisors didn't know. It's not so long ago. It's not ancient history. And this is part of the destruction of the labor movement in the Reagan years, carried out very overtly. I mean, Reagan basically informed employers that the government's not going to implement the laws. And in fact, Business Week later reported that firing of workers for illegal firing of workers for attempting to organize, I think, tripled during the Reagan years. Clinton added his own version of that. It was called NAFTA. NAFTA provided one of the main predicted and, in fact, actual effects of NAFTA was to provide employers with a method for illegally preventing organizing. So if workers want to organize in some plant, the owners could, run a meeting or put up a sign saying Mexico transfer job or something, meaning if you try to organize this plant, we're going to Mexico. That's illegal. But if you have an outlaw state, it doesn't matter what's illegal. So in fact, disruption of organizing efforts by illegal means, I think, increased, maybe 50% or so under Clinton, partly by this method. And it continues. I mean, right now, Obama, part of his platform was to permit the so-called card check, the Employee Free Choice Act, which would give workers an opportunity to join unions by will if they wanted without employer coercion. That was a huge propaganda attack on that, blocks democracy and so on. We don't forget that. But the relevant point is it's declined, and it's nowhere, you can't find it in the agenda anymore. It's somewhere hidden somewhere, because it's part of a long tradition that's pretty natural in a business-run society, and this is very much a business-run society more than others, to try to make sure that people remain atomized, isolated, not organized, and hence essentially under control, even with freedom, formal freedom. So, but it is a very unusual labor history in the industrial world, and that, I suppose, relates to the fact that there are not the kind of organized protests now, to the extent that there are in Europe at least, against the impact of the crisis that was created by the financial institutions. It's worth remembering, it's not just the financial institutions. I mean, for American workers, there's a crisis in the core economy, manufacturing industries as well. But the dramatic crisis right now is financial institutions. They essentially created it. Now they're being called upon to fix it up, meaning return it to what it was before. But, that's a large theme of American history.